Welcome back to Sika Strength. Welcome back to Sika Stan. Today we're talking about using squats in your soccer S&C. So, although we'll be using soccer as the example sport today, this will go for a lot of the kind of non-contact field sports where speed, acceleration and power are absolutely vital. Also, we won't just be talking about the back squat today. We're also going to talk about the front squat and some slightly different squat variations. So at Sika Strength, we specialise in writing training programs, coaching athletes, perfecting their technique to the point where their S&C work is as effective and as efficient as humanly possible. So what we really want to do when we're looking at exercise selection for specific sports, we want to see, do we need it? How much of that do we need? And is there something better that could do the same job but maybe less fatigue or maybe less effect on the actual sport itself? So when we look at soccer as a sport, there's a couple of things going on. The first thing is that we obviously need as much sprint speed as humanly possible. We also need to be very resilient to injury. So it's not just the injuries that might come about through very fast acceleration and deceleration or change of direction, but also the injuries that might come from a collision with a player or an injury that might come from the actual kicking of the ball. So that very, very fast hip extension can cause some issues. Now, obviously, the squat is one of our go-to exercises in sports strength conditioning, but should it be applied for something like soccer? And when we look at the literature, it looks like it should definitely be applied and it should definitely be a part of your standard training program, whether that's in season or whether it's off season. So there's two main areas where we should be using the squat. There's two main reasons we should use the squat for soccer. The first one is injury prevention, particularly lower body injuries, which is obviously pretty obvious. And then the second reason is that we need to be developing as much power in the quads, glutes and hips as we possibly can. So let's take a look at injury prevention firstly and why using the squat might be more advantageous there than another exercise. So when looking at a study by Beto et al. Called Implementing Strength Training Strategies for Injury Prevention in Soccer, Scientific Rationale and Methodological Recommendations, we see a couple of things popping up. So the first thing we see is that lower body strength training, what they refer to here as standard strength training, is absolutely vital for injury prevention. Now, the injuries they tend to be looking at here will be ankle sprains, so rolling over on your ankle, then looking at strains of the hamstring and strains of the adductors. Now, obviously, a lot of time what will pop up or a common question we'll get is that if the hamstrings tend to be so commonly injured in a sport like soccer, why do we use the squat? So obviously, firstly, there are ways we can target the hamstring. Something that pops up repeatedly over and over again in the literature is the use of the Nordic hamstring curl. And it's really effective. It gains a lot of strength in the hamstring and in the hamstring tendons. But when we look at the adductors and hamstrings together, using the squat can really effectively train both of those. And that's the reason we see so many soccer players at the professional level squatting on a weekly basis. So most of the time, it's once or twice per week, both in the in-season and the off-season. But they're targeting that lower body area with standard strength training protocols. There's nothing crazy. A lot of these studies will look at flywheel training, eccentric only training, and the repeated thing that comes up over and over again is that you need standard strength training protocols, and that most of the time we don't want to be doing a massive, what they'd refer to as mixed modality training program, where we have the flywheel work and we have the eccentric work and we have standard strength training and we have plyometric training. Mostly what they see, and in the kind of larger scale studies, is that standard strength training interventions, both across male and female, junior and senior level athletes, seem to be the most effective thing for preventing those lower body injuries. Now, it's interesting here. Obviously, we want to be developing integrity in the hamstrings, integrity in the adductors, but why would squatting also help with things like ankle sprains or knee ligament injuries? What we're probably getting here is obviously we become more stable because we're stronger, those muscles are better able to contract, but we also get an added advantage of using a back squat, a front squat, a safety bar squat, so we get better neuromuscular recruitment, we get better balance coming along with that, and generally speaking, the athletes tend to be more skilled in placing themselves on the floor, in putting a lot of force through the ground and force through their legs, and that seems to be where that lessening of the injuries is coming from, obviously in combination with the increased strength and integrity of the muscle tendon units. Now, another interesting thing that pops up and an interesting point of discussion here is there an easier exercise? Is there an exercise that everybody will be able to do without that necessarily developing that skill? So something like a Smith machine squat, maybe a machine squat, so like a hack squat, or something along the lines of a hex bar deadlift, which would very closely emulate those positions we get in the squat, but maybe have a much steeper learning curve or an easier transition from somebody who hasn't lifted weights to going into the gym and then training themselves or getting coached. Now, from what I can see in the literature and from what most of the larger scale meta-analyses say, is that normal free weights training is more effective than these. So obviously, for the reasons motor skill learning, better balance, better development of the athlete, generally speaking, is probably what we're seeing there. So now the second point, that actual performance benefit. How can we make a better soccer player and how can we use a squat to get us there? So the main thing we're looking at here is the athlete being better in their acceleration values and top end speed values. So obviously soccer players are phenomenally fast. They cover a massive amount of ground in each game and they need to have repeated sprint performance that's better than their opposition. Now the squat's the most obvious one to go to here. Obviously other exercises maybe more along the power end of that force velocity curve come out here. People will talk about using power cleans or doing something that's a bit more dynamic. But really, when we're looking for a soccer player to produce as much force as possible, going from a standing start or maybe in a change of direction environment where they're sprinting, they have to turn and go the opposite direction, then it's the maximal force stuff is really where we should be looking for most of their training. Now, the other interesting thing that pops up with this is whether we do squats in season, whether we do them off season, and what frequency we should be doing. Now, most of the literature will agree that lower volume, higher force squats should be done in season and definitely on a weekly basis at minimum. So famously, we would have had Kelly Starrett talking about his work with Arsenal Soccer Club. One of his agreements with Arsenal when he was working with them, he was working in an injury prevention context, but one of the agreements was that they'd be squatting heavy at least once per week. Now, I'm not sure if that still goes on at the club. That was obviously around 8 or 10 years ago now, but it's interesting to hear even back then, they're so focused on that high force output, quite low volume, but it goes the whole way throughout the season. Now, when we look at what we should be doing in the off season, we should probably be looking less at the idea of just kind of holding on to the strength or slowly building strength. We should probably be using that quite short off season to have a quite expedited strength training protocol. So something that's going to be quite aggressive, something that will build that squat, maybe put 20 kilos or 40 kilos onto your squat in the course of 2, 3, 4 months when you're not playing soccer. Obviously, as we mentioned at the start, when we're in a strength and conditioning coaching environment, our main goal is to do no harm. So a lot of the time people will think of us picking programs as a thing where we want the most effectiveness, we want the most physiological change, we want the biggest impact on their performance. Well, really, that's probably goal number 2. Goal number 1 is do no harm. And so if we were to be in season, really pushing that squat hard, it is likely that we will have some negative affect on the games they're playing at the weekend or on their training sessions. And obviously, impacting a game is massively important, but if we have an athlete who's pushing hard to make the squad or maybe make that first team in their club, then they can't be showing up in poor shape to training sessions. And so because of that, their S&C has to be moderated in season. Now, the big advantage with the off-season is that for many soccer-playing athletes, they're not going to be massively strength trained. And for that reason, we'll tend to see quite large increases in 1RM during that 2, 3, or 4 month period. So if you're a soccer player and you're wondering what should you do with your squat, whether you should be doing it or shouldn't be doing it, I would say you should definitely be squatting. If you've no idea where to start, check out the Sika Strength app. You can download it. You can do a 7-day free trial, see how it works, see how those sessions work for you. Just clear it before the end and then you're good to go. Now, what would I recommend for your squatting? I'd probably recommend something like the Road to Anywhere squat program or the Road to Anywhere 2.0 squat program. This will have you squatting twice per week. You can get weekly video feedback from myself and Owen on the members stream. And also, you have dynamic loading adjustment. So as you go through the squat cycle, If you just printed off a PDF from online, you're just going to have to follow it on each one. We have dynamic loading as we go through, so those loads will change slightly as you go through each training session and get the most effective strength training block possible. Thanks for watching.